let's delve
For
a
real.
little bit into the contribution of federal policy into producing this situation. So I know that the situation that you're describing in Alberta is even more out of hand, let's say in British Columbia, especially in Vancouver. And Vancouver's a much bigger city with a much darker center. I mean, Vancouver had some downtown places that were like seriously bad 40 years ago. And that's certainly spreading on the western coast. Now, my understanding is that Canada at the federal level in some ways took a page from some of the European countries that were experimenting with decriminalizing drug use. Now, I have some sympathy for that viewpoint because it isn't obvious to me that the so-called war on drugs was a success, and I think that its attempt to crack down too brutally on users of, at least in the past, somewhat more benign substances like cannabis, and I mean benign in comparison to alcohol, say, which is legal, I think a fair bit of that was misguided. But I do know that countries like Portugal, for example, that spearheaded this, they didn't just reduce the penalties for drug use and distribution, let's say sales and distribution. They did that in concert with what seemed to be the kind of things that you guys are trying to pull off in Alberta, right? It wasn't like the Portuguese allowed people to be stoned out of their mind derelicts on the streets just because they stopped criminalizing use of even the harder drugs. My understanding is that in Canada, we did the first part, which was the easy part, the decriminalization that allowed the moralists to hand wave about how compassionate and wonderful they were.
Yeah.
But we didn't do the second part, which was the conscientious part
The
that
social part.
involved the identification, treatment, cleanup, and even sometimes criminal prosecution of people who had gone a little too far down the drug-taking hedonistic road, let's say. So
Yeah.
how do you see the problem that's developed in Alberta as a manifestation of
For
a
real.
broader change in legislation at the federal level with regards to drug
See,
policy?
drugs are legal here.
Yeah, and let me just first start by saying we're very proud our province has not become what's happening in BC yet, and we're not going to let that happen. That's why we're taking this action to make sure that we don't end up in circumstances like that here in Alberta. And you're exactly right. There's been an effort and a drive, particularly by politicians on the left in our country, to approach this issue of addiction in a way that essentially just accepts it as a disease and continues to give the poison that is causing the consequences to these individuals to them, and not work on and giving tools to be able to help an individual recover in those circumstances. We don't want to, I want to be very clear on this, we don't want to go arrest and put somebody in jail because they have a drug addiction. That's not happening in my province. The opposite is happening. We are reaching out to those individuals, we're getting them into circumstances where they can be safe, and we're providing them with the resources that they need to be able to recover. But the other side of this argument believes is that you need to just put them in a place like a tent or an apartment paid for by the taxpayer and continue to allow them to have poison put into their body and that somehow they will either magically get better. Well, the reality is they won't. I call that palliative care for drug addicts.
Yeah.
And
I
that is
agree.
where really the big
That's a
difference
death
is in our
sentence.
philosophy. It's a death sentence, particularly when you're dealing with things like fentanyl and these type of drugs now. I mean, it's just going to get you at some point. I mean, alcoholism, which can be a real tough circumstance, and we're dealing with that too on the streets. But that is many decades to get to what we're seeing some of these new drugs do to people in weeks on our streets. The reality is that there's no safe supply when it comes to fentanyl. You cannot take fentanyl safely. Eventually you're going to OD. This is why inside medical facilities, even where people are taking fentanyl, often paid for by the government,
Hey, Ralph,
or
what's
other
up?
types of chemicals like that, you'll have to have nurses there to be able to interact with overdoses. Our government really believes we need to go the other way, which is that we need to reach out to individuals in this circumstance. We need to invest in resources that they will need to deal with root causes that have caused their circumstances, and give them a way to be able to recover. And that's where it comes. But I think the 10 cities prove that we're right, because the reality is if anybody thinks putting an individual in tents in minus 50 degrees Celsius in Canada is a safe way to live, with propane tanks exploding and people burning to death and all the things that I have just described today, that is more safer than what Alberta is saying, which is Come on into the shelters. Let's get resources around you, and let's help you get better. And you know what's interesting, Jordan, is the individuals that are coming out of the encampments, most of them actually want what we're bringing forward. And that's why in the last 3 weeks, as we've done encampments, over 200 of those individuals coming out have gone to what we call our navigation centers so they can navigate support. They've received over 500 referrals to different services. Many of them now are in permanent housing type of circumstances, actively working on their recovery, dealing
I'm
with
doing
the
good.
medical circumstances that may be around them, and ultimately many of them will go on to have productive
Just looking
lives.
at how
That's
the
what we want. That's
legal
with the other side
landscape of
selling,
my
it's
province
just
is
accepting that
changing.
somebody's going to die and giving them a death
Apparently
sentence.
all
I like
drugs
that
are
you
legal
use
here now,
those
for
words,
sure.
because I think it's true. That's the result
Oh, yeah.
of what they're doing.
No doubt about it. Yeah.
This guy's like our
It's always
justice
made
minister or
if that
something.
fails, you know, so.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's.
Or his
now,
minister of
I
seniors,
was
community, and
interested in
social
you- in
services, but
talking to you
either way.
in part so that we can
He
walk
said the
through
drugs are legal
a
here.
description of the tent cities, and then even more importantly, shed some light on the fact that such cities are almost immediately taken over by the most psychopathic gangs you can possibly imagine. That's an important thing to establish because it eradicates the notion that this is some kind of compassionate approach to these
gangs
poor,
are super
unhoused
bad
people
in
who are
those
just
fucking
trying to
tents.
live, you know, in a happy community. No, wrong. Okay, but mostly why I wanted to talk to you was on the remediation and treatment side. So the first thing I want to ask you is about your sociological goal. Now you implied at the beginning of this conversation
I bet the climate
that
there would be beautiful
there
for
aren't
weed.
going to be any more tent cities in Alberta. Now is that the goal? Like to return to 30 years ago, say, where there weren't tent cities. That just didn't happen. You know, there's the odd person under a bridge. There's the odd homeless person. It was very, very rare. There certainly weren't communities of homeless people. So is your government's goal to attain that end? And if so, how far along are you and what's your timeline?
So yes, our goal is to make sure that we are not seeing dangerous tent cities inside our cities. You know, I can't.
Somebody
say
should
that
take
we
a
would
boat
ever
up
be
and
able
down
to
the
fully
Mississippi
eliminate
and just
it. You know,
fucking
tent cities could pop up
dump
at any
seeds
time,
out.
but that we would stop in the future this being the management tool to help with this population, and instead that we would invest in proper resources. And most importantly, what our government's doing that I think is courageous is that we're actually stepping in as a subnational government to support a municipal police force to take down those encampments. And we're going to do that for two different reasons. One is to help the individuals in, which I'll get to in a minute, the individuals that are in those encampments. But second, to help our citizens who live in places like Edmonton. Edmontonians don't deserve to have this in their community anymore. They deserve to be able to walk down the streets and feel safe. You know, the last 3 weeks as we tore down encampments, Jordan, our team with the city of Edmonton collected 129 tons of garbage out of these tent cities alone, including 3,000 needles. So it just shows you what is taking place inside those tent cities and how dangerous it is to the rest of the community. But we want to go one step further. We want to then make sure these individuals receive full wraparound support and the best opportunities that they can.
You think lower than 20%? You think's okay?
Find themselves in.
Okay,
We're not
so-
delusional.
Okay,
We do
so
realize
we'll go,
there's still going to be homeless people, but
Right.
we don't believe it's
I have a
gonna be
hard
this
time
big.
with lower
Okay,
than
so
20.
we'll go to the treatment of individuals in a moment. So I want to flesh out the sociological element a bit more first. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, you know, one of the things that's happening in Toronto is that the tent cities increasingly occupy public spaces. And I think that's utterly inexcusable because I don't believe that the municipality, for example, has a right.
But that could all
to
be
either
terpenes.
take
I have no
away
idea.
Parks from people, including children.
I just
who
know
use
the
those
best weed
parks
I've
more
ever
than any
smoked,
other-
I grew.
Than any other people, and need them, especially in the cities. They certainly don't have the right to take those away. They don't have the right to take them away and award them to other people who don't own them, and haven't purchased them, and have no contractual right to them whatsoever. And they also don't have the right to fail to protect those parks. And so tell me where you saw the tent cities emerging and what that meant just in terms of occupation of land for the people, say, in the surrounding neighborhoods.
So I've seen tent cities emerge in many different type of locations within the city, but you're right. Most often it ends up inside the green spaces in the city. And I know you know Edmonton, so the beautiful river valley of the North Saskatchewan River that flows right through that city, you would see tent cities all through that area. And well, that's areas where people go and jog and they ride their bikes on the weekend. They take their dogs for a walk, and it's part of wanting to live in the city and being able to get outside within that area that you call home. You see the same thing in Calgary along their beautiful Bow River that flows through that city. That's often where you would see tent cities pop up. I've also heard horror stories, particularly in the city of Lethbridge, which I mentioned has a really tough drug problem right now, of families trying to take their children out inside playgrounds at local community parks, and them ended up being sometimes punctured by needles or other things that are happening because the tent cities that have occupied that little park, that, it may not be as big of a tent city as we sometimes see in Edmonton. It may only be 4 or 5 instead of hundreds, but it's inside that area where children are playing. So you're right, it takes away from people being able to enjoy the city and that green space that they have. And Banff National Park inside our province, for some of your American viewers, very similar to Yellowstone, a pretty beautiful place. I like it. I can't just take my tent and set it up anywhere I want and start living and causing trouble for everybody else who wants to be able to come and enjoy the park. It's a silly argument for anybody in municipal politics to say that this is the right thing to do for their constituents, is to allow something like this beautiful green spaces to be wrecked for the people that they represent.
Starting a business can be tough, especially knowing how to run your online storefront. Thanks to Shopify, it's easier than ever. Shopify is the global commerce.
Yo ho, all hands, hoist the colors high. Heave ho, thieves and beggars, never shall we die. Now some have died and some are alive, and others sail on the sea. Yo ho, all hands, hoist the colors high. Heave ho, thieves and beggars, never shall we die. Now some